and welcome to our video lesson on editing the comparative essay. This segment will be appropriate for Year 12 Advanced English. So we're going to talk about the editing process. The first thing you want to do is write your draft on a computer. You'll find that if you start off by writing your drafts by hand, you're going to be really reluctant to edit along the way because it means you have to cross things out and then write them all over again. So it's much better to write on a computer where it's only a matter of copying and pasting. Then you want to take a break. Ideally, that should be at least a day or two, but if you're on a very tight time schedule, an hour will do, so long as you do something else in between. Watch a video, play a video game, something like that, so that when you come back to your work, you're writing with a fresh eye. You want to make sure your essay fits to the integrated essay structure required of comparative essays, and to make sure that you prune it back neatly so that you're not having any excess paragraphs in there. Edit several times until you feel this is perfect. Then show a tutor or a teacher and get some feedback from somebody else. The important thing about this is when you get your feedback, you have to make sure you apply it. So a lot of people will give their work in and expect to get a lot of marking back, and then they'll look at it and go, oh, okay, and they'll put it in a drawer. So what you want to do is straight away, as soon as you've received the information, you want to go back and do your editing then. That's when everything will be fresh in your mind and when it will have the most effect on making your essay better. So you're going to keep this process up until you feel your essay is perfect. So when you go to edit your essay, you want to cut out the things you don't want before you start adding in the things that you do want. So if you have an idea and you add and embellish it, you might find that when you come to cut things later, you cut out the whole idea, so you're effectively wasting your time. It's much better to cut out what you don't need first. So the first thing that's easy to notice that you don't need are words and expressions that you've put in just because they sound good. So we call this killing your darlings. So anything that sounds fancy or clever, but doesn't really contribute to your argument. Be tough and cut it out. You also want to make sure you have one focused train of thought. So you might ask yourself, does my essay branch off into sub-themes or go away from my thesis? Do I ever say anything which is slightly contradictory to other things I've said in other paragraphs? So this is kind of applying the common sense test. You want to make sure that your essay makes sense as a whole, not just paragraph by paragraph. So the important thing is to have one sleek, logical, sophisticated argument. Another thing you want to do is avoid storytelling. This becomes a really easy mistake to make when you're doing comparative studies because there is so much information that you have to relate. So if you've provided a sentence which describes what happens in the text but doesn't actually contribute a technique or a quote, cut it out. Likewise, if you've started rambling about what life was like in the historical context that you're talking about, but you haven't linked it directly to a historical fact or back to your text, you want to cut that as well. Avoid repetition. So you want to avoid repeating the same technique, so talking about metaphors in every paragraph, or using the same quote again. Using the same quote in two different places in your essay is a very big no-no, because it makes it look like you only know a very bare handful of quotes from the text. So at all times you want to show off your diversity. Also avoid repeating the same conjunctions, so don't say however, 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 or in conclusion sentences, thus, thus, thus. So you want to try and use variety there because it becomes monotonous and it actually starts getting our attention. Don't repeat adjectives either, especially things where you're saying that the text is engaging or insightful. The more you repeat these words, the more we're sure that you don't find the text either engaging or insightful. However, if those words are part of the keywords of your essay question, it's okay to repeat them. Now, some teachers will tell you not to use the keywords exactly and to just use a synonym of that word. That's actually not very good advice. You want to make sure you use the exact keyword for two reasons. One, because that shows the marker that you're writing about their question and you haven't pre-prepared. And two, because you might pick a synonym that isn't exactly what the markers had in mind. So you might find that you write an essay similar to what they wanted, but not exactly right. You also want to be consistent in your references to aspects of the text. So again, this is advice that some teachers will give, that you should say themes, ideas, notions, and concerns, but that can be confusing. So in my opinion, you should pick one and stick to it. So that's all the stuff you might want to take out of your essay, and that can be a pretty devastating process because you might edit your 1,000-word essay and find that you've only got 700 left. But this is when you come to add the stuff that you really want to be in your essay. One of those things is contextual values. So you must discuss a different contextual value from that time period in each paragraph. So if you're doing Pride and Prejudice, you don't want to spend the entire essay talking about the economics of marriage. However, if the essay question does ask you to do that, that's the only exception. If it's left up to you though, you should always be providing them with a variety of information. Discuss the context of your younger texts as well. So you might want to read up about the 70s, 80s or 90s on Wikipedia, something like that. Don't ignore the younger texts. You may also want to add historical facts. So it's actually much better to cite a concrete fact than to have a generalization. So for instance, you might talk about an influential literary text at the time, such as Rousseau's Amélie, or an event such as the American War of Independence. That sort of stuff is a lot more convincing than just generalizations. Another thing to keep in mind is that you shouldn't be relying on personal context to get your historical information across. It's great that you know that John Donne had 6 children and that his wife died young, but you also probably need to know some stuff about the Jacobean era and the Renaissance too. Correct integrated structure. So if you wrote your essay using the same structure that you would normally use for something like belonging, you're going to need to restructure it. Again, some of your teachers might tell you it's okay to write an essay block by block, but you simply can't carry on a meaningful comparison across separate paragraphs. What you'll probably find is that you've ended up writing 2 very small mini essays, one on each of the texts you're supposed to discuss. So, resistance is futile. You must integrate. Shaping and reshaping frequently gets left out of students' essays. It's probably the thing I write in the margin of people's essays the most often. Show that the ideas from one text influence the way you interpret the other. So for instance, it might seem completely natural that in Frankenstein the monster has to die, until you watch Blade Runner and you see that a replicant gets to live. So that might make you rethink that the monster in the first text got a raw deal. So the younger text can influence the older one, and the older one can influence the younger one. Keep both in mind and try and keep a two-way flow when you're discussing shaping and reshaping. Another thing you might like to add are buzzwords and jargon. So these are words that will get your marker's attention, that either show that you're well read or that you really understand your topic. So you may be substituting in more specific terms for general ones, especially in terms of techniques. So you might be describing an extended metaphor instead of the more generic imagery. If you've learned impressive new historical context terms, be sure to use those as well. So for example, you might be talking about the noblesse oblige in the Regency era, or Unitarianism in the Romantic period. Make sure you add these ones in as well. Likewise, if you've learnt fancy new technique terms like metonymy, caesura, or anaphora, it can't hurt to use those. Again, we always want to use variety in technique terms. And it might even be a good idea to have a look at the quotes you've used and decide to use either a longer one or a more relevant one to make your case. Adding a thesis. So the thesis is a little bit different from Module A than it is from belonging. So it doesn't have to be as specific as your belonging thesis, because keep in mind area of study was a thematic topic, and so the thesis had to be thematic. But here you're actually going to be arguing about the value of comparative studies instead. So you want to base your thesis on the module rather than on the elective, and that's going to work better for a bunch of varied questions. So let's look at some example theses that you might use. Comparative studies are valuable because they make us question our traditional or encultured views. So that's quite a broad statement, but it's still something quite relevant to comparative studies. Another one you might use: comparative studies enhance our objectivity and encourage an analytical approach to literature. So in both of these ideas, the important keywords are comparative studies, values, and contexts. Those are the things you want your thesis to be based on. So how do you get better at editing essays? Well, the first one is practice. That's pretty logical. But you can also reread your study notes as you edit, because then you'll get some more sophisticated ideas into your editing. You can type and edit on a computer. You can read a lot of essays to get ideas on phrasing. Again, the more familiar you are with a text type, the better you are at writing it. So have a look for some good integrated comparative study essays. Practice a lot of diverse essay questions. This is the most useful thing you can do. So again, it's much better to have 7 or 8 really good essays that you've got on your computer that talk about a whole different bunch of essay questions than trying to rely on one core essay. Study reviews and academic essays online can also be helpful because they help you to sort of raise the tone of your essay and maybe increase the formal register of your language. That's the end of this lesson. If you feel like you need more help with editing, please visit us at www.primeeducation.com.au.